Okay, subscribers, my dear friends and supporters, you've put your nickel into this thing, and we're going to take you a little bit farther down this path. But fair warning, a lot of people who get into this end up becoming involved in it. Don't be too surprised if you don't see something or have some kind of odd encounter with this soon. It's not dangerous, I don't think, or I wouldn't be suggesting this, because Linda's gotten all of these letters and done all this research, and she's just had one case where somebody has been injured. But it might come into your life. It's in some way about some aspect of our reality that we don't fully understand, but that is quite real. Just a reminder at this point, Linda's book is Real Wolfmen. Her website is lindagodfrey.com. Linda, you spoke of the only case where anyone had been hurt that you had researched, and it made me reflect on the letters that we received over the years on after I wrote Communion. And there were hundreds of thousands of them, and in all of that vast quantity of letters, there was only one case where someone had been hurt. Now, but here's the odd thing. As I began to do independent research into this, I found other cases that were quite disturbing. And of course, as we mentioned, David Paulides has found a very large number of cases of people disappearing. And I want to ask you if it's possible in your mind that under the surface of this experience, could there be something very much darker, at least partly connected with it?
Well, I just leave all the possibilities completely open, because for the lack of a specimen to study, I just don't feel that I can say for sure that it's this or that. And I don't completely rule out the possibility that it is some kind of native wolf species that has adapted to walk upright when it wants to at sometimes. But having said that, it does seem that there are enough cases where there's just something really odd. They just don't seem like natural animals. And I do think that a small number of the cases could actually have different origins. I don't rule out the idea of human projected thought forms that appear to be shape-shifting, that sort of thing. I think there are lots of witnesses to that, too. And also, there's the idea of Native American guardian spirits. And I've been told by tribal elders of different nations that this is indeed the case. They believe, that these things were somehow set to conjure up manifestations of earth spirits when certain sacred areas are disturbed. And indeed, one thing that I do is map locations and look for cultural artifacts as well as geographical artifacts. And I find that very often, too often for coincidence, sightings are located at crossroads, old sacred sites, old military areas, these places that have they're sort of lodestones for human emotion and spiritual happenings. So, I just don't find that I can discount anything.
By the way, there is a study that has never been done, a book that has never been written and should be written, about the relationship and connection between military bases and sacred sites, because there is one, most certainly. There are people behind the scenes in the military who are siting bases in sacred areas because of the power that they know is there.
Right, and I've talked about that in a couple of my books. I think I mentioned it in this one, too, again. And there are two possible ways to go with that connection. One is that there's sort of a sacred geometry or sacred geology or electromagnetic properties, perhaps, belonging to these sites, or the buildup of long-term spiritual energy from, being used as sacred sites. Or it could also be that sacred sites and military sites both desire the same physical characteristics, which is a high location. For military, it's, for defense and ability to look a long way, and proximity to water, especially fresh water. And again, you can see why both of them want that. Sacred springs for the ancient sites and life-giving water source,
And that, now, just to, I hate to interrupt my guests, but I just
not at all.
I have to put this in. Of course, in the fairy lore of Northern Europe, fresh water is a huge factor.
Yes.
And the visitors I knew were obsessed with fresh water.
Really?
One of the oh yes, and this is very common. You will find dozens of UFO cases of people seeing these ships hovering over extremely pure water sources. And interestingly enough, the stream behind my cabin, not far from it, was 7 miles long, and it was one of the few streams left in the United States that rose and it moved entirely through protected land. It never even crossed a road, and it was only a few miles long, but that water was so pure you could drink it right out of the stream without hesitation.
These days, that's amazing.
And they were there, I think, in part for that reason.
Wow. Well, the other thing is that fresh water, especially where there are springs, are believed by Native Americans that I've interviewed to be long, ancient portals between this world and what they call the spirit world, what scientists might call the next dimension.
Yeah, exactly. And I find that fascinating because there's something about other dimensions, in my opinion, connected with all of this. Mm-hmm. And recently there was an absolutely remarkable experiment conducted in a laboratory in France where they were counting neutrons in a type of jar in which they can isolate individual neutrons. And to their surprise, some of the neutrons would disappear and then reappear again. And there is only one way this can be explained, that they were being drawn out of this universe by a magnetic field in a parallel universe. Mm-hmm. And the scientists involved would never say this. What they're saying is, well, we need to study this more closely. But it occurred to me immediately that someone in that same lab in a parallel universe might have been signaling to them.
That's a great thought.
Yeah. Now, I go back always to Colm Kelleher's book, Hunt for the Skinwalker, where a dire wolf comes up to the Nids Ranch, walks up and jumps into a paddock full of goats. They fire at it. It is impervious to bullets, but the bullets bother it enough to where it goes back down into the marsh from which it came. The thing is, dire wolves don't exist in that part of the world anymore, but they did in the Pleistocene, and in a parallel universe, they might still.
Right.
Maybe these are creatures that you're just let me finish. Sure. Maybe the creatures you're dealing with have evolved an ability to move across the divide between universes as a defense mechanism, say.
Right. Well, that would certainly explain a lot, and according to, again, my Native American sources, they believe that Bigfoot and the Dogman both have this ability, that when they're here, they're totally corporeal, they need to hunt, they need to eat meat, but when they want to go back, they just go to the portal. And that would certainly explain how we could track a Bigfoot with visible right and left prints a mile through a snowy cornfield in January, and suddenly the prints end in unbroken snow.
Exactly what happened to the wolf that appeared on the Nids farm.
Right. Its
prints were found going out into the middle of a marsh, and then they just disappeared. And they were even tested. They analyzed the prints and found that the animal was 300 pounds, weighed 300 pounds. Because it was, as it happened, all of the scientists who were getting ready to take over the ranch arrived at the ranch just a short time after the animal had been there. And it's like the kind of interference that we talked about earlier, that it's almost like there's something beyond all of this that kind of knows what's going on.
Right. Yeah,
you know?
It's amazing.
You feel watched right now? I have to admit, I kind of do. It's kind of creepy, actually.
Yeah, I sort of get that feeling. My office has a huge window that looks out over the neighborhood, and we actually live right next to one of those kettles. And I've heard sounds down in my own kettle. So, yeah, I do feel rather watched. So
you have a kennel with dogs, or?
Oh, no, I'm sorry, a kettle, one of those bowl-shaped depressions.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I understood. I'm sorry, I didn't understand you. You threw me off. I thought, my God, have I missed something here? 'Cause, I read the whole book, and now I want to get into the black dog phenomenon, because that also it relates a lot to the whole UFO alien question. Can you describe black phantom dogs as you understand them from the book?
Right. I've often noticed that a very small percentage of the total sightings seem to fall into another category altogether. They're very much like the black phantom dogs of England. They do things like appear and disappear. They appear in people's bedrooms or even their homes in broad daylight. They're often described as resembling Anubis, jet black. Often the fur is short and shiny rather than long and shaggy. And they seem to be interested observers. They'll look around, they'll observe the person, they will make themselves known, and then they disappear, scaring the bejabbers out of whomever was in the house. And there's just this silent, eerie quality to them.
Very much so. I've had an encounter with a black dog, actually.
Really?
It didn't have a head like Anubis. It looked like a black Labrador retriever. And it was lying dead on the porch of some friends during a very bizarre morning in our cabin, where we kept hearing strange noises coming from under the cabin, like a distant drill, like someone was drilling deep under the cabin. And a man I was talking to about our road suddenly had a stream of blood coming out of the center of his head where the third eye is. And he had to go home and staunch the bleeding as best she could, and he left. Then we went to some other friend's house to talk about the road, and there was this black dog, short, shiny hair, lying on their porch, dead. And
bizarre.
they were concerned because their cat had suddenly disappeared. And we had a little boy with us in addition to our own son. He was interested in butterflies, so he walked into their room, which overlooked a stream where there were a lot of butterflies at that moment. And he suddenly turned around with a look of horror on his face. And just as the woman said, "We found the cat," the boy whirled around. He had a cap on, I noticed, that said cat on it. I hadn't noticed it before. It was a little baseball cap. And blood was just gushing out of both of his nostrils.
Oh, my goodness.
And we rushed him home. I called his mother. He'd never had a nosebleed in his life. And we took him back to New York, of course, to the city. He recovered normally, and there were no after effects. The dog was sent to the state veterinary council. I forget exactly what it was called. And it was examined, and they could find no reason for the animal being dead. It was perfectly intact.
Wow.
Now, we were at the edge of another world then, and there was like lightning flashing between the worlds. And I just wonder if that isn't what all of your research is about. And I have to ask you a question. What draws you to this? Why are you doing this?
Well,
you never know where this is going to go.
That's true. And I often call myself the accidental werewolf chronicler because this is not the life path that I ever foresaw for myself. But I was prepared to take on a story of high strangeness at the time that it was presented back in 91, 92, because I had studied UFOs and psychic phenomena and all that sort of thing quite consciously for a number of years, and had always been interested in that. Not cryptozoology, but, most of the other aspects, and had lived in a haunted house and that sort of thing. So, I felt that I was prepared at the time. Never could have imagined that 20 years later I would still be doing this, but every time I write a book and I think, well, this is the last thing I can possibly write on this subject, more just comes flooding in. And I see new insights, I see new correlations and connections, and I feel that somehow this has been given to me to chronicle for some reason, and I know a lot of people think the idea of an upright dog man is ridiculous, but I know too many people who have seen it. I know too many people who have seen Bigfoot up close. And I know they're seeing something. I don't know what it is, but the more I document, the more I write, the more I put things together, the more it does all seem to be interrelated. And sometimes I feel that this place I've been studying in the next county was almost put there as kind of a little microcosm of all the different questions, because there have been UFOs that have visited it. We've had actually a human-looking dog man that was seen by two people. They turned around just in time to see it getting into an unmarked white van that then vanished. They couldn't follow it. I mean,
wait. Let's back up. There's a lot flying here. It's thick and fast, and it's all fascinating. A human-looking dog man. Can you describe what that would look like?
And this is my first and only report. It was walking along. They thought it was kind of a shabby homeless person at first. It had very long, extremely matted brown hair. They could see it had a faded, tattered hat and old jeans and flopping shoes. And when they drew up close to see if it was a person in need of attention, it turned around and actually snarled at them and had a muzzle, black-rimmed eyes like a wolf's eyes, fangs, actual long yellow fangs, not human teeth. And they screamed and stepped on the gas. And that's when, these were two people that I know. They called me, and I said, turn around and go see where it went. And they did, much to their credit. And that was when they saw it getting into this unmarked white van. They tried to follow it, and the van, and this is out in flat land with no woods, it turned a corner, and they couldn't find it anymore.
Now, let me go down another path here. A lot of my listeners, and me included, have had many experiences where something like that has happened, where something has turned a corner and it's gone. Many. I mean, that happens a lot. But I want to shift gears just a little bit and explore the possibility that these creatures could be something that we have made. Now, folks, if you go to unknowncountry.com and put in the search term Plum Island, and you don't have to be a subscriber to do this, a lot of stuff will come up. A lot of things will come up that suggest that creatures that are in some way profoundly genetically altered are among us, that have ended up out in the wild. And I have to ask myself, could these be human-animal hybrids that we have created, or someone has? Maybe not us. How do you react to that possibility?
Well, I have addressed it. I think that probably the science of hybridization is farther along in clandestine labs around the world than anybody knows. And the cases that we hear about are probably not the cutting-edge cases, but things that have been established for a while. However, these sightings of creatures go back to the 1930s when before computers, before we were able to establish DNA genomes and do all these sorts of things. And so I think they've been around quite a while longer than the science of genetics. And that would be probably my main argument for saying
let's hope that's true, because if they're being made by us, somebody, I mean, you talk about mad scientists, somebody's way out of control.
Exactly. That and the fact that there are just too many of them and too widespread.
Exactly. Are you working on any cases now that aren't in the book that you've just started on, perhaps?
Well, all of the stuff that I've told you about the area Bigfoot and that area in the other county where we have all the different creatures have been occupying a lot of my time. But I have cases that people have written in as well, more than I can even, been able to sort out. Just since I've started more publicity because of this book, people have been hearing. But, for instance, I have a letter right in front of me that I just got saying that in 2002, someone saw a dog man in McHenry, Illinois, and it was close to a cemetery, which is another one of these areas that it's always by. And between the cemetery and a freshwater area called the Nippersink Flowage. And she says, using the words, it was almost as if it was annoyed by our presence. It turned and looked at our truck menacingly, curling its lip briefly in a snarling fashion. Then it finished crossing the road, and this was on hind legs. And as it left the pavement, it returned to all fours, ran down into the gully, up the other side, and loped into the cemetery, where it was too dark to follow its progress.
Wow. So
and that's such a super typical report.
Super typical, and it's exactly. You may very well have something like that happen in your own life, folks, because I think that anybody who listens to this, given the way this seems to work, is liable to experience it. Frankly, I mean, I might even. Goodness knows, I've experienced plenty of stuff in my life. Let me ask you this now. What about the shape-shifting issue? This comes up a little bit in your book, and what do you think about it? And you referred just a bit ago to a dog man that had a very human appearance, and yet shape-shifting seems to kind of bleed over into the supernatural. It's a big part of Native American mythology and ceremonial practice.
Right.
Emerging out of their long relationship with the animal world as hunter-gatherers, when shape-shifting into the animal that they wanted to capture, or the animal that they wanted most to have the power of, was an important part of their ritual.
Right.
Could it be real in some way?
Yeah, and that's a very good way to describe that relationship. But some of them take it a bit further, and just in the same way that Tibetans use an extreme form of discipline to be able to project a thought form, make a thought a thing called a tulpa, I find by really researching and examining the literature that's out there from Native Americans on this topic, and some of it going back to journals from fur trapper days, it seems to me that it is more related to a sort of thought projection that either sort of covers the practitioner like a mental suit, if you will, that appears like this other creature, or if it's especially strong, that can go out forth on its own recognizance and then do things as directed. And this you find across many nations. And with different animals. For instance, the Canadian Cree have what they call the bear walk, where they're able to do this as a bear. So I really, really think that, and I don't have any doubt that the human mind is capable of far more than most people give it credit for.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that this is a lot likelier scenario than the idea that every atom, molecule, and corpuscle in a human being is able to change, along with DNA, because the DNA would have to change, to physically conform to the shape of another physical creature in every organ and part of its body. And I think in The Real Wolfman, I addressed this question at some length, and somebody had kindly thought up all the ways that the human body would have to change in order to physically change into that of a wolf. And it just seems too beyond the pale, especially when the human mind can do it so neatly on its own.
I wonder, because, of course, in movies like An American Werewolf in London, that delightful movie, and most werewolf movies, it's an agonizing kind of change. But I don't think if it's real, if shape-shifting is real, that there's any agony involved at all. I think that it has something to do with an aspect of the mind that we occasionally use, barely understand, but which is immensely powerful and perhaps once was central to our whole being, something that as we moved into cities and the moonlight at night became less and less important to us, and we became more and more directed toward one another and less toward the world around us, we slowly lost.
Right.
Well, Linda, it's fascinating and wonderful to talk with you. I fondly remember our 2003 conversation. I don't know quite why we didn't talk at all about your last book. I can't believe you never came on Dreamland, but I'm looking at my records and you didn't. I'm very glad that our mutual editors, Molly Brulette and Mitch Horowitz at Tarcher Penguin, made sure you got on the program, because it's been delightful. Could you tell us a little bit about the previous book, The Michigan Dogman? Could you tell us a little bit about it?
The Michigan Dogman, Werewolves, and Other Unknown Canines Across the USA is not just about Michigan. It's one of my first really comprehensive looks at sightings across the United States, and it contains more speculation, more theories, and some really scary encounters that people have had.
So, I wish we had it on Dreamland, and maybe we'll get back to all of this again soon and explore your current work, your new book that you're working on, and the Michigan Dogman, and just the whole vast range of high-level strangeness that hangs back just beyond our vision most of the time in the forests all around us. Thank you so much for being with us, Linda Godfrey. Again, her book, Real Wolfmen, her website, lindagodfrey.com. Okay, subscribers, my dear friends and supporters, you've put your nickel into this thing, and we're going to take you a little bit farther down this path. But fair warning, a lot of people who get into this end up becoming involved in it. Don't be too surprised if you don't see something or have some kind of odd encounter with this soon. It's not dangerous, I don't think, or I wouldn't been hurt. Now, but here's the odd thing. As I began to do independent research into this, I found other cases that were quite disturbing. And of course, as we mentioned, David Paulides has found a very large number of cases of people disappearing. And I want to ask you if it's possible in your mind that under the surface of this experience, could there be something very much darker, at least partly connected with it?
Well, I just leave all the possibilities completely open because for the lack of a specimen to study, I just don't feel that I can say for sure that it's this or that. And I don't completely rule out the possibility that it is some kind of native wolf species that has adapted to walk upright when it wants to at some times. But having said that, it does seem that there are enough... Godfrey.com.
Linda, you spoke of the only case where anyone had been hurt that you had researched, and it made me reflect on the letters that we received over the years on after I wrote Communion, And there were hundreds of thousands of them, and all of that vast, vast quantity of letters. There was only one case where someone suggesting this, because Linda's gotten all of these letters and done all this research, and she's just had one case where somebody has been injured. So, but it might come into your life. It's in some way about some aspect of our reality that we don't fully understand, but that is quite real. Just a reminder at this point, Linda's book is Real Wolfmen. Her website is